right. Hi, David.
Hi, Renee. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well.
All right. So let's start with the question I ask everybody on this podcast. Do you consider yourself to be a data scientist?
That's actually a good question, and having watched some of your podcasts, I've always asked myself that same question. I consider myself maybe a hybrid or a quasi-data scientist, primarily because my work entails a lot of different things besides just data science. So I incorporated a lot into my daily routine. So maybe if I'm an operational data science where I apply all these algorithms and methods into my daily work in order to help our end users.
Okay, that's great. Well, we're going to get to your work experience and your cool job that you have now later on. But first, let's start with your early days. So when you were young, was there anything that indicated that you would later go on to work with data in this way or, lead to the career that you've had?
Yeah, I look back at my career, look back at my life, and I think it was always because I was asking questions. I always wanted to find out answers, and I was always trying to determine the answers based on the data that I had at the time. They know I was doing it then, but at the time, when I was going through elementary school and on to high school, I was always the one people were probably shying away because I had a lot of questions all the time, trying to figure out how to solve different problems.
That's great. So take us through your education, all the way from when you were young through college, and you have multiple degrees. So give us the history.
Okay. First off, I am a first generation American here, so I always look at what we've been able to accomplish since my parents moved over here from Mexico. Mm-hmm. But standard public high school, public education, all the way up through high school. Went to University of Houston, where I got an MIS degree. Okay. Actually, I started off in engineering. From anybody back in the 80s that did any kind of engineering work, they probably remember having to take Fortran and having to take Fortran and program it with the punch cards. And too many times that I've seen people crying on the floor because their punch cards fell down. It just frustrated me. I said, there has to be a better way. And as I was walking by a different classroom one day, I noticed these students working on a monochrome monitor. I asked them, what are you guys doing? And they're programming. You're programming on a computer screen with a keyboard? What is this? So after I got more information, I found out that the school university started a computer program or class or schedule, and I joined that. I switched over from engineering over more to computer science, eventually made the shift more to management information systems because I wanted to have a broad range of knowledge across the information technology spectrum.
Okay, so did management information systems combine like the computer science and the business, and what was involved in that?
It combined the computer science with understanding how to implement IT or information technology within a business. Okay. So whether that's a database or a network or websites, all of that information was put together so you could understand how to actually apply that within a business as well as program the applications you need to develop.
Okay, and then where did you go from there? Did you start working right out of undergrad, or did you go into a graduate degree?
No, I started working right out of undergrad. Actually, I kind of made a little shift and went into a finance field for about 8 years. Developed doing financial management. It was the 80s. It was the era of big business and a lot of money. So I got caught up in that and decided to work in that for about 8 years. And then after a while, I felt I needed a cleansing of some sort from that field, and I worked as a manager within a nonprofit organization for 5 years.
Okay, well, before we move on, when you were in the finance industry, what were you doing? Were you programming software? Were you working with databases?
I was actually a stockbroker.
Oh, okay.
For 8 years, but even during that time while I was doing that financial analysis, I was the only one that actually had a computer that was running models and algorithms against the data to try to find the best investments of that time within my area. And at the time, I was running on a small 8088 processor, and I was excited because I had 64 kilobytes of RAM on my system, and my algorithms took maybe 8 hours overnight to run rather than a whole day. But I was still working with computer science and trying to look at algorithms to develop these models, and really that was always my love. But I got caught up in looking to try to see what I could do in the financial area for a while.
Mm-hmm. So what did you do with the nonprofit?
Nonprofit, I was the chief operating officer for the nonprofit, and my primary goal there was to help.
Your sound cut out for a second. Let me ask that question again. We missed the first part of your answer. Okay, so what did you do when you switched over to the nonprofit?
In the nonprofit, I was working as the chief operating officer. My main goal was to try to increase its budget. It was primarily state-funded grants and some federal grants. I did a lot of grant writing, but in my spare time, I started working with the infrastructure within the office there. So I started developing databases to try to, and back to Access 1.0. Utilizing that technology, and really found a love for database development at that time. And as I developed, I was able to increase the budget of that organization from about $700,000 to almost $3 million budget by the time I left, about 5 years later.
So I started in databases as well in Access, not with Access 1.0, but relational database design. So were you designing the database with the intention of doing reporting and data analysis on the other side? I mean, what was your approach there?
Well, it's primarily for reporting and some analysis. As a nonprofit organization, you have to create a lot of reports to your grantors. They want to know what you're using the money for, who's getting it, the demographics, the information of the between the genders, and what kind of results you were having. So, yeah, it was definitely first reporting and some analysis on how the funding that we were getting was actually helping the clientele at the time.
Okay, great. And then what was next for you?
After that, since there was kind of a downturn in the economy, and I started to look around, we had to shut some doors. I ended up leaving the company at that time, and I wanted to get back into my first love, which was computers. I always enjoyed that. I was able to land a position at NASA, and I was in my early 30s at that time. So I was landed a position at NASA for a year as a technical assistant, working on IT technical problems within NASA.
Wow, neat.
So I did that for a year, and the whole time I was working on databases and showing folks how to use Access and how to use different types of relational models. I was able to land that into a job at another NASA contractor doing at the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, which is the big 40-foot pool they have where they train the astronauts as a database developer.
Ah, what kind of data were they collecting that you were designing a database for?
Most of it was training information, both for the divers and the astronauts. What kind of training they're doing while they're doing their extravehicular activities or EVAs. How much training they've had, how many times they've been in the water, and a way for them to be able to understand whether the astronaut was fully trained before they go up into space to do the EVA. But I only did that primarily for 6 months. What happened after 6 months is my IT manager resigned, leaving us with nobody there to run the actual IT department within the NBL. So they've asked me to step up and take the position as the IT manager. So I was the IT manager there for the next almost 6 years.
Wow, that was a quick move up to a position you stayed in for a while. It was a definitely quick move up, but they still required me to do the database stuff. So I still worked with the database, but it allowed me to really use my MIS information and degree to work on websites, on networking. I put in a fiber optic network within there. So it really challenged me and expanded some of the work I was doing to understand the entire IT infrastructure. Great. So what were some of the early analysis tools you were using? Were you mostly developing like Access reports?
Access reports, did some Excel with the visualization, really kept thinking there has to be a better way many times. We looked at different types of software plugins or to do visualization and analysis. Most of it done with combination of Excel and Access. So as a government contractor at the time, funding was very, very tight. We couldn't go out and buy the big analytical tools.
So you said that role was for 6 years, and you're still at NASA now. So have you been at NASA the entire time?
From that time frame, yes, I went at NASA. I went from a contractor. At the end of those 6 years, I was hired on as a civil servant. Okay. Within the Information Resources Director, which is our IT arm here at NASA, as a workstation engineer, looking over the entire workstations at JSC at the time, which was about 12,000 workstations that we were responsible for.
So that was like an IT management role?
It was not necessarily considered a management role, but I was responsible for all the workstations.
Wow, that's a big deal when it's a place like NASA.
It definitely it was some challenging times.
Okay, so how did you get into, like, from there, how did you go into this current role, which I think you have the coolest title, and why don't you tell us what that is, and tell us how you got from managing a bunch of computers to what you do now.
Okay, so my current title is Chief Knowledge Architect for NASA.
I love that, Chief Knowledge Architect.
And it's something that I was able to develop and work through, because when I was asked my role as an IT workstation engineer, I then became a project manager and a project lead on different types of different projects, looking at how we implement encryption, how we do desktop backup. That led me to go actually to the Knowledge Management Office, which is a different change, because going from an IT to knowledge management, within knowledge management, what you're really looking at is how you take your data and transform it into knowledge that the end users can use. So there was a lot of use. So there's a lot of combination of not only strategy, but analysis and informatics to combine all of that together. So when I first started, roughly about 6 years ago now, I started looking at what we were trying to do and how we were trying to develop our knowledge for our end users. And many times people will have a knowledge management strategy, which are things such as lessons learned databases, case studies, risk analysis, dashboards, business intelligence, but they have a strategy, but they don't really have a way of implementing it. Mm-hmm. And that's what the IT arm is supposed to do. But many times they don't talk to each other in the same manner. They don't understand the same language. Right. And I'll give you an example. One of my first meetings I had when I joined the organization, I was talking with my taxonomist and my web developer, trying to figure out the best way to improve our search capabilities that we have. The taxonomist was asking for the metadata. She wanted to get some more metadata on the documents, on the information. The web developer didn't understand why she needed the metadata. And they've been having this conversation for several months. They've got into the heated arguments. I finally stopped the meeting. We called it, and I went back to them later on and said, okay, to the taxonomist, explain to me what is metadata to you. Mm-hmm. Data on the data, classic definition. I said, okay, I understand and I agree. Now, give me description. Well, you look at a document, you have the title, you have the author, you have the abstract could be part of the metadata, keywords. Okay, that's good. So then I went to the developer, gave me the same definition of metadata. I said, give me some definitions. Well, it's the type of file. In a database, is it a blob? Is it a binary? Is it a, so he's looking more on the actual information in the database as metadata, where the taxonomist is looking at the document and the key terms and information within that document. They had the same definition, but they were looking for two totally different information.
Wow, that's good.
So that got me to start thinking that we needed somebody that can talk all these languages.
Yeah, that's good. So you've been a translator between the two groups?
Correct. More of a liaison translator to get them to understand that they may be using the same terms, but they're applying it differently. But that was only the first piece of it, because then I noticed that now we've got the strategy and we've got the informatics or the IT infrastructure to transmit the data across our end users. We needed to have a way to actually mold or transform that data into knowledge, and that's where the data science piece comes in. Mm-hmm. We're using different models and algorithms to be able to take the information we have, put it in extract that knowledge, and then put it in a way that's useful to our end users.
Mm-hmm. So what have you found are some good techniques for working with that kind of team of multiple different backgrounds and people all trying to work on one project that all speak different languages? How do you approach that? Because I think that's where a lot of data scientists end up landing in organizations. It's kind of that in between the business units and the IT units and the database people and the tech people and management. So what are some things that you've learned over time that help you in that role?
Well, a good question. I think part of that, of course, and you may hear this all the time, and it's probably overly, it's just good communication. Getting mm-hmm. people to talk to each other, to understand what they're trying to say. The other part is that I try to bring them all together. And many times over the years when I looked at people doing projects, they have the project teams, but they work independently. I wanted to make sure that they were working as a unit together and they were housed together. So anytime they went to go work on a project to solve an issue for some of our end users, they went together as a team to gather the information, so they all had the same information, hearing the same information the same way from everybody, so they're on the same board. They're not having to translate back and forth to each other. Once they have that, they come back and then talk about it to make sure that they have the same perspective. And that's key to a lot of things that I found, is making sure that everybody is thinking about it from the same perspective, looking at it from either, in the case I just said earlier, either from the document side or from the database side. How are you going to define metadata and what you're looking for?
So kind of laying the groundwork as a group together before going off separately.
Yes.
Okay, great. And how large are the teams that you work with?
Generally, they're anywhere from 3 to 5. I try to have somebody that has some knowledge management capability, understands the strategy, how to work through that, somebody that has some information architecture or development capabilities, and then a data scientist. From time to time, my data scientist can do both. But generally, I try to keep them a little separate if I can, because there's 2 different worlds they have to actually work with, and so many different policies we have to deal with. I don't want them to be bogged down trying to solve one issue when I need them working on a different issue also.
Right. Well, looking at your bio, you have some additional education that we haven't talked about.
I do.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay. So back in 2010, I decided to go back for some graduate courses, and I got a degree in engineering management out of the University of Houston, Clear Lake. And that's primarily it equates to an MBA, but more for engineers, rather than looking at the business side of things. They look at how an engineer may apply some of the same things that an MBA learned within an engineering project on the technical side, trying to develop technical projects rather than developing a business. So I did that in 2012. I did it in 2010, graduated in 2012. Started looking around for a doctorate program that I could do without having to quit my job.
What was motivating you to continue your education at that time?
It's something that I've always wanted to do. I've always been a lifelong learner. I think I've always read. Many of the things I've done over the years, even going back to the database development, while I had a background in it, I wasn't immersed in it. I started reading a lot of books, started reading a lot of information on how to develop databases, on normalization, on how to develop your schemas. And so everything I've done, I've always tried to learn. I finally decided it was time for me to formalize it a little bit and get something out of it, just for business side of it, also for my work. So I decided to get that engineering management degree. But while I was looking for a doctorate program, I started taking statistics classes, working on a master's in statistics at the same university while I'm looking around. And I did that for almost 2 years when I came across a doctorate program I was interested in. It's actually in education, looking at how do we increase STEM students into the STEM field.
Wow. So what made you transition from engineering background into education?
A lot of it, I think, has to do with my stage in life. I am probably, at this point, 12 to 15 years away from retirement. And I look at that, and I probably do not want to retire at that time. So my goal is to be able to share the information that I've learned over the years and try to look at all the different aspects that I've been able to work in, from not only from a finance aspect, from a business aspect, from a knowledge management to information technology, and also from a statistical aspect, and be able to give back in a way that people can utilize. So I'm hoping to be able to eventually start teaching in a university.
That's awesome.
So my doctorate will hopefully help me to develop the curriculum in knowledge architecture that I can then apply at some university down the road.
Great. So we haven't gotten into the details of what is knowledge architecture. So tell us a little bit more about that, and then how do these different advanced education and engineering management and statistics and a doctorate in education, how did your work through that kind of inform you as a knowledge architect?
Well, let's take a look at the knowledge management side of it. That was something that I really had to learn and really understand, because when I spoke with folks about knowledge management here in the organization, and I asked them to tell me what do they believe knowledge management is, the big question I got was lessons learned. That's where you put all your lessons learned. But knowledge management is a lot more than that. If you really dig into knowledge management, there's probably, depending on who you talk to, anywhere from 50 to 80 different disciplines that you can look at within knowledge management.
And do you mean organizational knowledge management, like capturing what the people in the organization know and sharing that?
That's part of it. That's one of the possible concepts within knowledge management: organizational learning, case studies, making sure that you take that implicit information turn it into explicit, get that tactile information from, the tacit information that you are able to get out of the folks that have done the work over the years. I mean, if you talk to many organizations, you know that we've got an aging population. There's a lot of baby boomers like myself that are going to retire. I've got to be able to transfer my knowledge over to somebody else, or hopefully many people, for them to be able to use. That's a little bit part of knowledge management. How do we take that information out of people like me and be able to transfer it to the next generation for them to be able to use? So things like lessons learned, case studies, oral history, search. It's a major component of it. Analytics is also a component of knowledge management in the standpoint of dashboards and business intelligence, and being able to share that, visualize that information back to the end users. So that was a lot of learning on my own, but I wanted to increase my knowledge of how to develop projects. How to IT projects in particular, engineering projects. That's the reason I went into the engineering management masters to how do I manage, how do I effectively show this information, how can I better make sure that my IT projects come to fruition, because if you look at a lot of studies, 75% of IT projects generally fail.
Right, and in my engineering management courses in grad school, we talked a lot about the different stakeholders that are involved when you're doing a project like that. So can you talk a little bit about the types of stakeholders that you've dealt with at NASA, and how kind of tying in the knowledge management with the project management and engineering, it's just fascinating to me when I find other generalists, because I think I'm that way too. So when people aren't a very specific, like I am an engineer,
right.
It's a little harder to describe what you do. So can you get a little more into what kind of people you interact with and how your role fits into the bigger organization?
Sure. So at my stage and where I'm at, I interact with just about everybody within a project. So you got different folks or different groups within a knowledge architecture framework. You have knowledge engineers, you have data analysis, knowledge technicians, for lack of a better word. But all of these folks, they have different people they work with and different stakeholders that they work with. The knowledge engineer may work with the data creator, understanding how they created the data, how what's the data management plan that they have in place, is there one to begin with, and how can they grab that information, look at the metadata, and be able to actually store that in a way that's easier for us to apply some of the informatics to it to be able to show that. In my level, I work with from the project managers all the way down, primarily trying to get them all to communicate with each other and make sure they understand that from the get-go, like any project, a lot of the upfront work has to be done. Part of that upfront work, they have to understand this knowledge management life cycle. You need to plan ahead of how you're going to capture and create your data, how you're going to store it, where you're going to warehouse it, how you're going to model it and analyze it, and how you're going to visualize it. All that has to be done up front. And part of my role, because it's not something that people really think about, is to really educate them on some of the things we can do. But along with that, with the education, I have to be able to show them what are some of the IT tools that are available for them to be able to use to be able to do the knowledge management piece of it. Whether it's a website or a database or some type of visualization tool. My goal is always to look at the problem, then find the right tool for that problem. Too many times we got people that have a tool and they're looking for problems to fit it into with the hammer. So for my stakeholders, the project managers, the team members, the web development or IT teams, I also talk to the funding folks, so they understand, where the funding is coming from, how are they going to be able to use it, are there any constraints? In the government side, we have constraints on, what we can spend on and how much we can spend. Are there travel that we have to take, training, making sure that, to me, training is a very important thing among all teams. We should be training everybody within that team to make sure that they're able to then pass on that information later on and then grow with it. We can't hide or share that information. We've got to make sure that it's accessible to everybody.
What are some of the tools that you use to do that?
Currently, I've fallen in love with graph databases.
Mm-hmm.
So things like Neo4j I utilize with graph databases. I've got, of course, from a search capability, I'm using a tool such as IHS Goldfire, which gives me a good combination of keyword, faceted, and cognitive type search capabilities. I also use, of course, Elasticsearch, MongoDB for some document databases.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm trying. Part of my role as a knowledge architecture, of course, and I'm not sure if I mentioned, is to develop and implement a technological roadmap to transform data into knowledge. So really what that means is I get to play with a lot of cool toys.
Well, and a lot of those are open source. So what is the decision-making process like?
Funding, more than not. Yes, NASA has a fairly decent funding that they get from the government, but that's all allocated to a lot of the programs, the International Space Station, Orion, so a lot of that money goes there. My organization sits at a level where we support all the other programs and projects, but our funding is not for hardware and equipment like that. It's more for intellectual information. So we don't get a whole lot of money to do things. So a lot of times I start off with open source in order to understand the capabilities, to make sure that it's useful, something we can use, and then at the end, find a way to pay for that, either by going to the programs and projects and saying, look, this tool will help. Will you help me fund it so I can help you down the road too?
Okay, great. So it sounds like you bring a lot of things together. So
I try to.
And you mentioned that transformation from data to knowledge. So tell us what that means and what's involved in that.
Well, what I look there is utilizing the different types of data science algorithms, methodologies that are out there. So a quick example I can give is that probably about a year and a half ago now, I had a young engineer come to me, and he was going to look at the lessons learned database. One of the key things we try to teach engineers or anybody on a project team, that the first thing you want to do is go back and look at the lessons learned, see if anybody's done it before. And try to learn from that, try to gain some experience from that. And we have a really good group of people that will submit lessons learned on their information, but more often than not, if you ask somebody, about a lessons learned database, they say they don't use them because it's hard to find anything. And in this particular engineer, same thing, very similar happened. So he had a list of 23 key terms that he wanted to search for. So he went to our JSC search infrastructure, which is managed by the IT department, put in those key terms, and unfortunately couldn't find a whole lot of information. The reason being is because it was a keyword-based search engine, and it indexed over 10 million items. So it was looking at 10 million items, not necessarily just the lessons learned database.
Right.
And in this particular engine, it does a page rank algorithm, so the more people that look at a certain page, the higher it goes up in value, and that's the ones that are going to pop up. And a lot of these items that the person was looking for haven't been seen, haven't been looked at in years, so there was no reason for the algorithm to pick it up.
Okay, so it's a challenge of finding the more obscure items.
Right. So I said that started me thinking we got to do a little bit better. So I went to the IT group. I said, can you just index the lessons learned database and apply these key terms to it? They said, yeah, we can do that. A few days later, they sent me back a spreadsheet with 23 tabs, one for each of the key terms, and each of them had links to documents that may or may not be lessons that represent information but the engineer still had to go in there and look for this information themselves. I said, okay, no, we can do better than this.
You don't need a gigantic spreadsheet of links every time you want to search for something.
So it has to do something. So I started working on it, started thinking about it, and I as a sample, I took a little over 2,000 lessons learned from our public lessons learned database on llis.nasa.gov. I took all those lessons, downloaded them down. They were in a semi-structured state. It gave me a spreadsheet with a lot of metadata, the title, the abstract, and the actual lesson and information. So I took that and I imported that into R, into a data frame within R, and I looked at it, developed a corpus, and then I applied a topic modeling algorithm on the lessons themselves to group them into different topics. And then it ended up putting them into 27 different topics. And of course, you got to know what the topics are beforehand, the number of topics. So I went through some calculations trying to figure that out. So I got 27 topics out of that. Then I took those and correlated them against their self-defined categories. So now I know what categories, the topics. I have some information there, some extra information. So I then put that into a graph database. So with this graph database, I have the document as a node or an entity that's related to somebody who wrote it, where it occurred at a center, what topic it's in, what category it's in, and so now the end user, the engineer, was able to go in there and look at, I want to look at the topic that contains with water valves or fuel valves, which there happened to be a topic of that. So he was able to find a bunch of documents strictly on, or lessons learned strictly on fuel valve, water valves. So that was one thing he was able to do, so narrow down his search a lot quicker. He was able to get to the information faster. But because I was able to correlate these topics against each other based on the self-assigned categories, now I had topics. You could jump from one topic to another and find lessons you may have missed.
Right, because it would be enable kind of a drill through to the other, using the relationships in the graph. Okay.
Correct. And one of the things that was really unique on this was that we had a lesson in the fuel valve, and I give this example in some of my talks, that was correlated 3 hops over to another topic on that was more about battery hazards and fire hazards with batteries. And I couldn't understand, how is a topic that's more about fuel valves and water valves correlated to battery hazards. So as I started looking at the documents within the topic of fuel batteries, on battery hazards, there were documents in there, lessons learned about how these batteries leaked, or the acid corroded or contaminated a fuel valve or a tank that ended up damaging a fuel tank. So these are lessons that wouldn't have popped up in a standard keyword-based search because they were more about battery hazards, but by having correlated them using data science, a topic modeling algorithm, the engineer was able to find these documents faster and really quickly and be able to get more information that he can utilize within his project.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you would definitely want, so now you can think about where the fuel lines are relative to the batteries.
Right.
In addition to just making sure the fuel lines don't leak.
That's right. And then there's also the different types of programs that we're associated with. So if I was really looking more for robotics as opposed to flight control, I could look for lessons that are about fuel valve or water valves that are in the robotics area or in the flight control area. So you can narrow it down, almost a faceted approach, down to looking for lessons that have all that information inside of it.
That's great. So how do you think that relates to the kind of work being done both in other government organizations and also, outside in industry? When you talk to other people, do you feel like what you're doing with this knowledge architecture, your kind of method is unique to your team and to NASA, or is this really generalizable and there are people doing it elsewhere?
I think there are teams that are doing parts of it. I think that you may have groups. I think everybody does knowledge management to a degree, information architecture or informatics and data science. I think what's unique in what I've done is trying to be able to combine them all together to make sure that you have a group of folks, knowledge architects, that can speak all 3 languages. Because that's where we have an issue is that the communication across the teams many times leads to different answers or different scenarios. And I guess a classic example, we saw what happened when we had one of our Mars rovers was trying to land, and it crashed, and because one team was doing it in inches, the other team was doing it in meters. It's that communication area that we have to make sure that we're all talking the same language. That's where I think what I'm trying to communicate across in my version of knowledge architecture is that you have folks that can talk the same language across all 3 disciplines.
And it seems like there's a lot of areas of government where that happens, where you have specialists, but then they need to be able to talk across teams too. Like you hear about it a lot with different intelligence organizations and things like terrorism, where they'll be doing work in parallel, but not necessarily communicating those risks across to each other. So I can definitely see a lot of different applications for that type of work.
Yeah, totally agree. I think that's an area we can all learn to better communicate with each other.
Yeah, that's great. So if somebody listening is interested in this knowledge architect type of role, what kind of recommendations do you have for them in terms of learning and seeking out those kind of roles?
Well, first off, I'm always open to hear from folks, so that they can definitely reach out to me if they want information. But primarily, it's not a field that's combined yet that I can see. There are folks that have combined knowledge management with information science, or maybe some other aspects of it, but nothing where I've actually seen all three of them put together. So what I think if somebody's really interested, find a mentor, find somebody that maybe shares that same type of mentality, and try to learn together, pick their brains, understand how they communicate, how they talk the language, some of the different key terms within each of the languages, and really do a lot of reading. I can say that reading is probably the best, for me anyway, just to learn, to be able to pick up different books on different topics, but ask a lot of questions from different areas. Don't be afraid to go to an area you're not involved in. If you're in information science, don't be afraid to go talk to somebody in a knowledge management group and ask them, how can you teach me what you guys do so that we can better work together?
That's great. So how can people find you online and elsewhere?
I'm on Twitter, and it's probably one of the main things I look at David Meza 1 at Twitter, or at David Meza 1. Sorry. Then or on LinkedIn. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, or you can email me at NASA. I don't have any issue with that at david.meza-1 at nasa.gov. I'll be more than happy to answer questions. So part of my job, of course, within the knowledge management is to benchmark and talk to other folks. So it gives me an opportunity to share ideas with everybody and hopefully not only learn from them, but also pass on information too.
Excellent. Well, we'll definitely link to all of those in the show notes.
Great.
Well, David, thank you so much for talking with me today, and I'm sure people will gain a lot from this conversation. This was really interesting.
Well, I enjoyed it, Renee, and I look forward to hearing it.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.